Hi, everybody. Welcome to this non-proliferation and national security seminar featuring Laura Rockwood. Let me just give you a brief introduction. Laura is a senior fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. She retired from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, in November 2013 as the section head for non-proliferation and policymaking in the Office of Legal Affairs after 28 years of service. During her time with the IAEA, she was the senior legal advisor on all aspects of the negotiation, interpretation, and implementation of IAEA safeguards. Prior to her current position at the VCDMP, Laura served as the executive director of the Open Nuclear Network, 2019 to 2022, and as the VCDMP's executive director. She's currently a member of ONN's advisory council and the board of trustees of VRTEC. She is also the vice president of the Institute of Nuclear Materials Management, and she is also the only person I know who's ever been to a Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. She represented the IAEA when they won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2005. Welcome, Laura. We're happy to have you.
So I feel free to interrupt me as we go along, but I have a theory about the nuclear non-proliferation regime, and it's that it came about as a function of states' need for individual and collective security, and the threat that was posed to that security. It's talking back to us. The threat that was posed to that security by nuclear weapons. And the nuclear non-proliferation regime is certainly not a static regime. Some argue it's not even a regime. And it has evolved over time. And I believe, in my view, it has evolved as a function of shifting perceptions about where that threat is coming from. As the perception changes, the responses to it change, and the non-proliferation regime evolves as we go along. So what I did when I first came up with this idea was I started with first 25 years, 20 years, 15 years, 10 years, and it just got out of hand. But the point of it was that the slide remains the same size, but the number and the importance of the issues that come up during these successively shorter periods of time increases. So this is generally the point in time where I tell everybody to put their tray tables and seat back in the upright and locked position. We're going on a journey. So the dawn of the nuclear non-proliferation regime began with the discovery of the fissionability of uranium. Now, I'm teaching you guys how to suck eggs today, right? Because you probably you could tell me this and many more. The thing that always struck me was that Lisa Meitner, does anybody know what nationality she is? Was Austrian. She never got a Nobel Peace Prize. A lot of her guy friends did. It was heralded with the blast of most terrible brilliance at the desert of New Mexico with the Freeman test in July of 1945. What is the threat we're talking about? Well, as you know, this is history. It's of August, the United States destroyed the city of Hiroshima using an HEU fueled weapon, quaintly referred to as Little Boy. 3 days later, destroying the city of Nagasaki using a more complicated implosion type device with a plutonium core. Now, the first 25 years, you're going to see it starts with the first, and God help us, the only use of nuclear weapons against a populated territory. You see the brand new United Nations coming up with a resolution on what to do about atomic energy, and then the development of the IAEA and its very initial safeguard system. So, as I said, in London in 1946, the brand new UN had its General Assembly meeting, and the very first resolution it adopted was to establish a commission to deal with the problems raised by atomic energy. Terms of reference, it talks about the commission coming up with recommendations for basic scientific information exchange, how to control atomic energy so it's only used for peaceful purposes. The first reference to WMD, elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons and all of the major weapons adaptable to mass destruction. And this one, which is what most of us have been involved in, is effective safeguards by way of inspection. Now, in the early days, there was a lot of excitement about nuclear, that it might be used to take rockets to the moon. Energy so cheap you don't have to meter it. But during this period of time, these initial years, there was a hell of a lot of nuclear testing going on. And so people were constantly confronted with the downside of nuclear. You can't see it, you can't taste it, you're fearful of it. And in 1954, the US basically incinerated an island and really brought home the fear about radiation. And it was later that year that this Godzilla happened to be born on my 3rd birthday. He was a monster. He was awakened by and empowered by radiation, a metaphor for nuclear weapons. And as you can see, I'll go back to that, his skin texture was inspired by the injuries to the scarring of the Hiroshima bombing victims. But it manifested the fears associated with radiation. Sure, you can use it for good, but we don't know this. We don't understand it, and we're really worried about it. So what were the challenges of this first period of 25 years? How to make sure, so let me back up. During this period, you had a couple of countries who controlled the technology. And the theory was, all right, we'll be careful who our trading partners are, which worked really well for the US and its trading partners, perfectly well for the Soviet Union and its trading partners, but not so well for each other. Okay, so bilateral safeguards didn't give everybody that warm and fuzzy feeling that there wasn't going to be a proliferation of nuclear weapons through the misuse of supplied material and items. So how did they address this? First of all, technology holders said, we'll just be careful. Don't tell us what to do. We'll be careful whom we share it with. And let's create an international verification body that will be responsible for creating a system that would allow it to verify the non-misuse of supplied items. Began with the creation of the IAEA in 1953. It was proposed by President Eisenhower in his very famous Atoms for Peace speech. And 4 years later, the IAEA was created with its headquarters in Vienna, Austria. It actually is now at the Vienna International Center, which is Trans-Danubia, but it was originally set up in a hotel on the Ring in the city of Vienna. And there's actually a plaque on the front door of that hotel, the Grand Hotel, commemorating the establishment of the IAEA in a hotel. It's an independent intergovernmental organization. And I make that point, first of all, because I'm a lawyer, but second of all, because we are not subordinate to the United Nations. It is a separate entity. The Director General is of the same level as the Secretary General. I mean, he doesn't report to the SG, if you will. But we actually have, and I still say we, forgive me, we have a unique relationship with the Security Council. The IAEA has the right and also the obligation to report certain things to the UN Security Council, which is unusual. Most other bodies that are in the UN system actually have to go through ECOSOC. They don't have that independent right of access. Currently, 180 member states of the agency. The membership of the UN is not identical to the membership of the IAEA. And it has to do with states that used to be about neutrality and that sort of thing. But most of these countries, I'd be surprised if most, if not all of these 180 are also members of the UN. And it was the statute of the agency that authorized it to implement safeguards. A couple of provisions in this little orange book. The agency can implement safeguards in 3 circumstances. One, if it becomes involved in the actual supply of nuclear material for a nuclear facility, if they broker the deal. Example, Ghana wants to buy a miniature neutron source reactor from China and goes to the agency and says, can you please broker this deal? And the agency says, of course we can. but only if you accept safeguards on it. Okay, that is the only situation in which the agency can compel a state to accept safeguards. This statute is not self-executing, another favorite lawyer expression, meaning nothing in the statute requires you as a member state to accept safeguards. So if we broker the deal, if you have a bilateral or multilateral arrangement pursuant to which the agency is requested to apply safeguards, think NPT, nuclear weapon free zone treaties. Mind you, this statute was negotiated in the mid-1950s. When did the NPT come into force? 1970. Okay? So it was very prescient. And also to any of the nuclear activities of a state at its request. Now, something I want to emphasize is anything the agency does by way of verification stems from Article 3A5. We have gotten into the habit of thinking of safeguards as what we do in the non-nuclear weapon states party to the NPT. It's not true. Sorry, it's only partly true. It is anything that the agency does in terms of verification of safeguards, not in terms of security or safety, derives from Article 3A5. Now, there are two other provisions in the statute you should be aware of. Article 12 talks about what safeguards would look like. Now, this was negotiated pretty late in the day of the statute. And the negotiators decided safeguards should involve on-site inspection, anytime, anyplace access, reporting and record keeping, and what to do in the event of compliance. If you don't notice, I have italicized anytime, anyplace access. Not because that's the way safeguards work. Sadly or otherwise, they don't. But what I emphasize is, imagine a treaty today, including anything remotely like that. What it tells you is how fearful the negotiators and the states were about the spread of nuclear weapons. You wouldn't get a treaty today that said anything like that, okay? And finally, the definition of nuclear material, which you guys probably know better than I do. We don't have the same definition as the US government uses, as I understand it. You talk about special nuclear materials or things like that. So in the agency's lexicon, special fissionable material and source material. Cesium, those kinds of things, those are not considered nuclear material for purposes of IAEA safeguards. A couple things you might not know, just because most of those countries that are members of the agency become members, doesn't mean they have to accept safeguards. That's why when people complain about Israel, India, and Pakistan, everybody goes, yeah, that's unfortunate, but that doesn't mean, just because they become members of the agency doesn't mean they have to accept safeguards. Safeguards are possible in non-member states. North Korea used to be a member of the agency and withdrew, and I always get the dates confused, whether it was I think it was 94, they withdrew. If the North Koreans invited us back tomorrow, we could send our inspectors there, okay? Now, you can also implement safeguards in a non-state territory, Taiwan, China. People's Republic of China. By the way, you'll never see the word Taiwan unless followed by comma China in a UN document. It's kind of like Coca-Cola. The Chinese make damn sure it's always Taiwan, comma China. We implement safeguards in Taiwan, comma China, as if it were a non-nuclear weapon state party to the NPT. Why would the People's Republic allow that to happen? I think it serves their own security purposes. Little other explanation that makes any sense. Now, fundamentally, I don't know if any of you remember that Marchin and Deparchin video that came out a number of years ago. It doesn't work that way. We have to have the consent of the state. They can manifest it voluntarily, such as the South Africans did after they announced they had a nuclear weapons program. Sui generis arrangements. For example, Argentina and Brazil concluded a safeguards agreement with the agency before they became parties to the NPT. Ukraine, by the way, before it became party to the NPT, also concluded a safeguards agreement. Security Council Chapter 7. Under Chapter 7, Any state that becomes a member of the UN agrees in advance that if the council demands that it carry out a certain action, it accepts that and is bound to do that. It's called, in my view, it's kind of like prior consent, like Iraq, 687 in 1991. Iraq, you will allow the agency to map out and dismantle your nuclear weapons program. They didn't initially do it, but they did eventually. But it's an obligation on the part of any member of the United Nations to implement a Chapter 7 request if they are requested to do so. Mostly what the agency does, so is safeguards agreements. And safeguards agreements are international treaties. Every one of them has to be approved by the 35-member Board of Governors. It's then signed by the state, or in the case of Euratom or Argentina, Brazil, multiple states, and the DG. And it has two ways of entering into force, either on signature or written notification received by the agency. I've noticed that even in the JCPOA, people use the word ratification. It's wrong. Even if Iran, even if their Majlis ratifies the additional protocol tomorrow, that doesn't bring it into force. They have to send a written notification to the agency saying, everything we needed to do, we've done. We don't care whether it's ratification, publication of a Federal Register announcement, sacrifice 3 chickens, it doesn't matter. The day that notification received by the agency is the day it enters into force. And that's true for the safeguards agreements as well as the additional protocols we'll talk about later. Good news is most states don't allow even their head of state to bind the country just on signature. Most countries require something else. But if they choose to do so, they can implement the agreement pending its entry into force, which is what Iran did after it concluded its additional protocol with the agency and did again under the JCPOA. So 3 different kinds of safeguards agreements. Here in the US, we implement the voluntary offer agreement, much as we do in China, France, Russia, and the UK. Item-specific agreements in India, Israel, and Pakistan, we call them item-specific because only the things that are identified in the agreement are subject to safeguards. Mostly what we do is implement what used to be called full-scope safeguards agreements, we now call CSAs or comprehensive safeguards agreements. And for the life of me, I don't remember why we started calling them CSAs as opposed to full-scope safeguards agreements. Sometime in the early 90s, it started happening, but I don't remember, and I've never been able to recall. So when I first started the agency in 1985, I didn't know the first thing about safeguards, but the people in safeguards said it's much easier than chem and bio because there are only 2 kinds of material that can be used for nuclear weapons. One is HEU, doesn't grow on trees. The other is plutonium, likewise, doesn't grow on trees. So my idea was, let's ban HEU and PU production. Well, it's not that easy because obviously you can use it for civilian purposes. And all kinds of assumptions back then. You need nuclear material, you need a lot of nuclear material. You only need uranium or plutonium. And don't worry about small quantities of nuclear material because you know what scientists are like, right? They're gonna play around with this stuff and you can't make a weapon using small quantities, right? One piece of advice I always give students when I teach them is be careful about your assumptions. So the item-specific safeguards agreements, as you can see, lots of holes. These are not non-proliferation agreements. They are simply non-misuse agreements. I, Israel, promise not to use that reactor for my weapons program. These do not oblige the state to forswear nuclear weapons, right? So what was happening at the end of this first 25-year period? The Cuban Missile Crisis, which gave rise to the negotiation of the very first nuclear weapon free zone treaty for an inhabited territory, what we call the Tlatelolco Treaty, the Latin American and Caribbean. Interestingly, from the point of view of the US, states with territories in the zone of application can become parties to one of the protocol and promise to respect the non-proliferation undertakings with respect to territories for which you have de jure so by law or de facto responsibility. The other big issue in our business is negative security assurances. Tlatelolco Treaty is the first and only time that all 5 of the nuclear weapon states legally bound themselves not to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapon state. The only time. And this is a subject of considerable debate within the NPT context, which gives rise to simultaneous negotiation of the NPT. As the Tlatelolco Treaty was being negotiated, so is the NPT, which was eventually opened for signature in '68 and entered into force 2 years later. It creates 2 different categories of countries: the nuclear weapon states, who promise not to provide nuclear weapons or nuclear explosive devices to non-nuclear weapon states. What is a nuclear weapon state? A state that has manufactured and exploded a nuclear device before 1 January 1967. What does that make India, Pakistan, and North Korea? States possessing nuclear weapons, but we don't call them nuclear weapon states. That's a term of art under the NPT. For their part, the non-nuclear weapon states agree not to acquire nuclear weapons or nuclear explosive devices. This is a group of technical people here. What's the difference between a nuclear weapon and a nuclear explosive device? Anybody? Exactly. Nothing. And that's why both things, they go boom, are prohibited under the NPT. Now, what is not prohibited? What nuclear use is not prohibited? Let me back up. What military nuclear use is not prohibited under the NPT? Melissa?
Naval reactor.
Bingo. Submarines. 2 things that were really, really a big deal when they negotiated the NPT: submarines and peaceful nuclear explosions. Please. Mostly that's not discussed. Submarines, a lot. And all states parties agree that if you're going to transfer nuclear material or single-use items to a non-nuclear weapon state, you'll insist on safeguards as a condition of supply. You agree to facilitate the exchange of technology, Article 4. You'll constantly hear the Iranians referring to that. And everybody, not just the nuclear weapon states, is required to pursue negotiations on disarmament. Not so much activity in that regard recently. So, first 25 years, we move on. This is 2 decades. Starts out with the entry into force of the NPT and ends 20 years later with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. What were the challenges we were dealing with? Well, it turns out that a lot of these countries had access to uranium and really talented scientists. You know, the US and the Soviet Union didn't corner the market on smart guys, right? So what were we worrying about was states developing their own indigenous nuclear fuel cycles and creating their own sources of nuclear material that they could use for nuclear weapons. So states got together and said, let's do this NPT and make sure that the IAEA is able to verify not just no misuse of supplied material, but no misuse of produced nuclear material. And the technology holders got together and said, agency, you stay out of export controls, we'll take care of that. So we didn't have a safeguard system for the NPT, it had to be created. This document, IMCIRC 153, was negotiated by Committee 22, an open-ended committee of the Board of Governors of the IAEA, to which many states, and at that time, most states weren't parties to the NPT, most of them participated in the negotiation of this document. This has been the basis of comprehensive safeguards agreements ever since 1971. Under these agreements, the state accepts safeguards on all sorts of special fissionable material in all peaceful nuclear activities. Now, one of the test questions I ask when I give this lecture is, oh, okay, does that mean the state can go, this material? That's in a military activity, it's off limits. Does that make any sense to anybody? No. It's good, because under international law, you don't interpret a treaty in such a way as to defeat its very purpose, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that that would allow the circumvention of safeguards. This is language from the NPT, and the assumption was all the nuclear material in a non-nuclear weapon state, we placed under safeguards, and if you wanted to use it for submarines or some other activity, you would make an arrangement with the agency to manage it, okay? So, basic obligation, in order to be able to report to the agency and to provide access, it needs to have a mechanism for collecting this information. So you license your nuclear activities and you require your licensees to tell you what you're doing, what they're doing with that, okay? And that is the information that gets reported to the agency. Plus, it's not just the state's responsibility, it's also the agency's responsibility to cooperate. The agency has a twofold objective for its part. One is the timely detection of diversion, and I don't think timely means after the state has a nuclear weapons program. Timely detection of diversion of significant quantities, right? Because it takes a lot of material to make a weapon. To the manufacture of nuclear weapons, nuclear explosive devices, for purposes unknown. The agency doesn't have to prove that a state has a nuclear weapons program. All they have to do is say, you know, there should be nuclear material here and there's not, or what's this doing here? It doesn't belong here. So the bar is a reasonableness, and so the element of proof is a pretty low level. And deterrence by the deterrence of diversion by the risk of early detection. The example I like to give to the students is if any of you drive cars, and I bet everybody in this room would raise their hands, right? In Vienna, you take a bridge that goes over to the VIC, and it goes kind of like this. Everybody used to like speed across it like crazy until they started putting a radar cop just the other side of that hill. Now, I don't know about you, but I slow down now when I come to that, and that's deterrence. So the idea is timely detection of diversion and deterrence by the risk of early detection. The better safeguards are, the less likely states will try to cheat. Now, two types of diversion, actually, both of which is illegal, use of declared material for prohibited purposes, but also failing to declare and using it for prohibited purposes. So what happens if, as in the case of North Korea, we start doing our initial inspections to try to verify North Korea's declaration about its nuclear material and its nuclear facilities. And we start using this brand new technology called swipe samples. And all of a sudden, what they're telling us they did doesn't match what we're seeing. The swipe samples we took at the radiochemical laboratory, right? So we went back to them over a period of months and said, doesn't make sense. And nothing they explained away the problem. So we said, okay, we need some additional information that isn't routinely given to the agency. And those two things that kind of look like they used to be waste sites, but you've now concealed them, we want access to those things. The North Koreans said, no, there's no nuclear material there and it's military. The IAEA's lawyer said, it doesn't matter that there's no nuclear material there. If we need access to that location in order to fulfill our obligations under the agreement, we can seek a right of access under special inspection. And PS, it doesn't matter whether it's in a military activity because there's no automatic exclusion for military activities under 153. And of course, the North Koreans immediately went, oh, no. Okay, all right, well then we can go to the board and say, dear board, we think it's really essential and urgent. And if the board agrees and uses these magic words, guess what? North Korea has to give us access. Notwithstanding that we weren't looking for undeclared nuclear material there, we wanted to take waste samples. Notwithstanding that they were military. So of course, the North Koreans in response to this said, no. Okay, so we went back to the board and said, dear board, you have a problem on your hands. We are unable to verify that there's been no diversion of nuclear material. Interestingly enough, 153 says the board may then report to the Security Council. Statute says must. Interesting. For another discussion. Anyway, 153 has served as the basis for all the NPT CSAs. They're required under all of the nuclear weapon free zone treaties, as I mentioned, Argentina and Brazil. And the US agreement, if you open it up, you're going to say, gosh, that looks a lot like 153. But as with the other nuclear weapon states, the scope is much more limited and it varies from country to country. So the US is pretty generous. It offers all of the civilian nuclear activities for safeguards, and the IAEA can pick one, some, or none. And the same is true under the other 4 voluntary offer agreements. Somebody once told me, it's interesting, there are people who complain that we only do limited safeguards in the nuclear weapon states. And there are countries that say, who complain about the fact that we do safeguards in nuclear weapon states. And sometimes it's the same country. It just depends on the context, right? So routine safeguards coverage, we thought we were doing pretty well by the end of this 20-year period. There were some, some gaps, but and export controls, you have the development of the NPT export controls, and then the NSG following India's first test of a peaceful nuclear explosion. What was it called?
Smiling Buddha.
Exactly, Smiling Buddha. I tell you, those scientists, they really have a sense of humor. Anyway, after that, even the non-NPT suppliers got together and said, maybe we need to pull up our socks a bit. So by this time, this was 1990 NPT review conference. We were already taking a look at how we were doing safeguards. Where we went and how often was limited. Nobody worried about small quantities of nuclear material. We were very much focused on declared materials, what we call now correctness. But we weren't, as a matter of course, applying a completeness standard. That is to say, we weren't providing assurances that there was no undeclared nuclear material in the state. Research reactors, yes, because you can, play monkey business with them. But by and large, it was simply as a matter of practice, not as a matter of law. Limitations on export controls, no requirement for full scope safeguards, no controls on dual use or weaponization related things. No procedures for exchanging information on export denials, so countries could go shopping. Country A won't sell it to you, go to country B because they might, okay? And nobody wanted the agency in the export control business because we're way too political. So this, my friends, changed everything. This was the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq in 1990 and 1991. Okay, this is just 10 years. Look at the number of data points and the significance of them. Discovery of Iraq's nuclear weapons program, we start strengthening safeguards. South Africa, North Korea, NPT gets extended, model additional protocol, another nuclear weapon free zone. India and Pakistan come out of the closet and go, those things were nuclear weapons tests. It's a busy, busy period. Tuatha. This is a line drawing of just the Tuatha site in Iraq. Just one site in Iraq, where we used to send our inspectors twice a year with announced inspections to 3 facilities and 1 loft. Lo and behold, look what we found when we went into Iraq under Resolution 687, just at Tuatha. Everything from soup to nuts in a nuclear weapons program. And how did they do that? They went shopping. They went to countries and bought dual-use items, brought them back to their brilliant scientists, created their own single-use items. Did they have to use massive quantities of nuclear material? Gram quantities. They were able to do R&D on many of these activities. The first 2 reports of non-compliance that we issued were gram quantities of nuclear material. Okay, so all of a sudden, member states look up and go, geez, maybe we ought to reconsider. What about undeclared nuclear material and activities? What are we going to do about that? Well, let's make sure the agency can verify not just no diversion declared, but no undeclared. And the export controllers got together and went, shoot, maybe we need to cover dual use items. So the first question that was asked is, does the agency have the authority to do this, to verify correctness? State says, I have 5 tons of uranium. We got 5 tons of uranium. Question is there anything else? That's correctness. Most of you are probably US citizens. I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. That's correctness and completeness, okay? So we went back and looked at 153, the lawyer did, and said, well, as it turns out, a provision that shows up in every single comprehensive safeguards agreement says that the agency has the right and the obligation to ensure that safeguards are applied on all source of special fissionable material, not just that which is declared, but all of it, okay? So member states got together and went, well, shoot, why don't you do that and do it better? Why don't you provide us assurances of the correctness and completeness of states' declarations? These are busy years. This is a picture of our team in Iraq with Sami Al-Araji and Trevor Edwards, if any of you know him, our enrichment specialist. Argentina, Brazil conclude a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the agency. That was a plus. This is a picture that is traditionally shown about South Africa's nuclear weapons. I have been told by many South Africans, this is not a picture of the South African nuclear weapons, but everybody uses it. And North Korea. We're kind of in and out of North Korea like a yo-yo. But during this period, we were in pursuant to the agreed framework. Here's a slide. I don't need to go into the details, but I include this because even today, I still hear countries say the agency doesn't have the right to verify the absence of undeclared unless they have an additional protocol. Look at these. South Africa, special inspections, North Korea, 1991, 1992, 1993. Now you don't know this, but I produced the first draft of the model additional protocol in 1996. Okay, so the authority to verify correctness and completeness stems from the safeguards agreement itself. The additional protocol simply helps us do it better, more effectively. It came about as a function of Program 93+2, which was headed by a guy named Rich Hooper. Did any of you know Rich? It's fabulous, fabulous. Who used to be our director of concepts and planning, preceded by Ray Parsec, followed by Jill Cooley. So we took a look at what we could already do under existing comprehensive safeguards agreements without any silly business. Undeclared locations, early provision design information, environmental sampling, satellite imagery, evaluation of the state as a whole. But we came up with some measures that we thought would be useful to be standardized across all these countries. More information about the nuclear fuel cycle, broader access, and simplified administrative procedures. And this became the model additional protocol, again negotiated by a committee of the Board of Governors, Committee 24. What's new? All parts of the nuclear fuel cycle, not just nuclear material and facilities. We invented a new type of access so it wasn't confused with inspections or DIVs to places beyond nuclear material and facilities, manage access, protect sensitive information, and some administrative measures that made it easier for us to get our inspectors in and out of countries. Again, this is one of those slides that I emphasize to the students that are just learning about safeguards. The agency's right to do unannounced inspections, we could already do that under 153. The agency's ability to request access to undeclared locations, special inspections, also possible without an additional protocol. And fundamentally, the agency's right to verify correctness and completeness stems from principle paragraph 2, 153. Great, we can go home because no more proliferation of nuclear weapons. right? Not so fast. So anyway, the idea was on strengthening safeguards. If, taking into account all the information we have, we see no indications of diversion of declared and no indications of undeclared, we can draw what is now called the broader conclusion that all nuclear material remained in peaceful activities. And if we are able to assure ourselves in particular that there's no undeclared reprocessing or enrichment, we can maybe change the way we do safeguards in that country. Okay. Looking at tailored safeguards because it made sense, right? Was a concept that we developed in the 1990s. Export control developments, they pulled up their socks. They created their Part 2 dual use equipment, full scope safeguards as a condition, future supplies until the US-India agreement. And they started exchanging information with each other. So it was harder for states to work around export controls, okay? If you ever want to know about export controls, don't ask me, go to this document. Anything that says IMCIRC is a public IAEA document, and every 4 years or so, the nuclear suppliers get together and update this document. It's really a useful document on export controls. Let's see how we're doing on time. Gotta quickly. Actually, this might resonate with some of you. It was a Tuesday afternoon in September, beautiful day in Vienna, absolutely brilliant. Nobody wanted to come back to the afternoon session of the Board of Governors. And we're just sitting down at our desks and putting on those old-fashioned silly headsets and where you could get radio stations on, right? And people were turning the station. And there was this buzz going on. And all of a sudden, Mohammed's speechwriter came dashing across the front of the board, consulting with Mohammed. And Mohammed says, "We've just heard the plane has crashed into the Twin Towers." Why is this important here? Well, interesting. The agenda we were discussing was the CPPNM, Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, and whether it should be amended to include domestic transport, whether it should be expanded to include other radioactive materials, and if it should be addressing non-state actors. Non-state actors, what if that had been a reprocessing plant or a reactor? What if they didn't have nuclear material, but they had a lot of cobalt or cesium? This was to nuclear security what Chernobyl was to nuclear safety, and Iraq was to nuclear safeguards. It was, as they say in the South, a come to Jesus moment. So this new millennium, part 1, not even 10 years, what were the challenges we were addressing them? What to do about non-state actors and RDDs? Improve the physical security and ensure domestic and transborder controls. What's the difference between the two? Safeguards is about detection and deterrence of diversion of nuclear material by a state, whereas nuclear security is about detection and deterrence of misuse of nuclear material and other radioactive substances by non-state actors. Caveat: what Russia is doing at Zaporizhia, nuclear security issues. So maybe we need to take another look at what we mean by nuclear security. Security Council gets in the act, Resolution 1540 on WMD and the role of non-state actors. 2002, 2009, you may recognize these two guys, Hans Blix, who was by this point charged with UNMOVIC, chem, missile, and bio investigations into Iraq. Mohammed had succeeded Blix as the DG for the IAEA, and the person sitting directly behind Mohammed, where in the world is Waldo? That'd be me. And the guy to my left, Jacques Boat, was the guy who figured out that the Niger documents were fake. So this is Olli Heinonen, famous unto himself, when we were first discovering the problems in Iran in 2003. Should remember this Iranian guy's name, but I don't. This was Libya, the Libyan governor to the IAEA after their incipient WMD program was dismantled. Here he is signing an additional protocol. And here's a Pakistani professor teaching scientists how to play football. Or not, right? And this is a building formerly known as a reactor in the desert of Syria. North Korea, again, in and out, in and out, in and out, out. We haven't been back since 2009. Now, it's not all bad news. 2005, Mohammed al-Baradei, tall guy on the left, and the IAEA win the Nobel Peace Prize. I believe it's because Mohammed was willing to speak truth to power, and it was well received. I was invited to go to this along with my friends, Selma Hayek and Bob Geldof. So, there's some high points here. Whoa, we're not out of the woods yet. This is 2010, 2019. Look at the things that happened. Iran, Syria, JCPOA, no JCPOA. North Korea tests its third, fourth, fifth, and sixth nuclear weapons. What were the challenges? Well, first of all, the Russians went on the warpath about what we were doing in terms of strengthening safeguards. What is this state level concept? This is really awful. We've never heard of it before. Please, you did, you may have forgotten. What to do about Iran and North Korea. And the US and DPRK, God knows what was happening there. So this is, again, where in the world is Waldo, standing next to our then DDG for safeguards, Herman Nackhartz, Jacques Boat in the back, the guy behind this woman here, who's he? Max Saparo, the current head of the Department of Safeguards. And Ali Sultanea, Iranian ambassador. This was when we wrote a report for the Board of Governors, the annex to which explained to the board why we were so deeply concerned about the developments in Iran. Actually, I had to write that annex, not knowing more than the basics about nuclear weapons, having to interpret Jacques and another nuclear weaponizer, and to try to write an annex that wasn't a recipe book for a nuclear weapons program. Read it, it's interesting reading. It's the November 2011 annex. So yay, peace breaks out. We have the two-track political and technical conclusion of the JCPOA. It's approved by the Security Council. DG comes up with a report on outstanding issues. Implementation day, yay, 16 January 2016. Boo, US withdrawal less than 2 years later. And here we are, my friends. With the same president in place who starts out with fire and fury and is now best friends forever. Is there a positive point here? Is it possible that Kim Jong-un might get over his loss of face from this disaster that happened back then? Maybe, maybe. If so, that might be a bright point. Ban treaty, nuclear weapon freeze, treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. I'm not going to go into that. What next? Okay, this period starts out with, this is my favorite. It starts out with cannibal hammerhead worms, locusts invading all of the East Coast. The US military announces the existence of UFOs and nobody cared because it started with the coronavirus. So the NPT review conference, the 50th birthday party was supposed to happen this year. It was scheduled, postponed, postponed again. North Korea says, we're tired of doing this. We're gonna blow up the liaison office. You have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Just before that, the AUKUS announcement, which we'll talk about on Wednesday. So we finally had the NPT review conference in 22 instead of 20. And notwithstanding everybody's fear that the Middle East would be a problem, Iran, North Korea, AUKUS, it was ultimately the issue of Ukraine and Russia that led to the Russian Federation not consenting to the draft document that was going to come out of the NPT review conference, the single issue. Future issues, I'm gonna have to say more on that. US-China-Russia relations. AI, you cannot go to a conference nowadays related to anything nuclear without somebody talking about AI. I refer to it as the good, the bad, and the ugly. Weaponization of outer space, I think that's the new frontier again. And my real question is whether the NPT regime can survive. If the nuclear weapon states don't make progress on disarmament, this is getting shakier and shakier. And that is no joke. So if the NPT collapses, all but a few of the safeguards agreements will cease to be enforced just like that. Like that. Gone. Will JFK's prediction about 20 to 25 nuclear weapon states arising come about? Maybe. So today's regime it's not really a regime. It's kind of like a patchwork quilt. It's like whack-a-mole. Something comes up, you fix it here. Something comes here, you fix it here. It's security, what to do about safeguards, export controls, blah, 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 blah. Disarmament, assurances of supply. If this is today's regime, I ask you, what is tomorrow's regime going to be like? Because guess what? You guys are in charge of it. And now you can put your tray tables and heap backs in the upright and unlocked position we just landed. So if there's anything I haven't gotten to that you'd like to know about safeguards, ask away. They put you all to sleep.
A little bit in shock. Are there any questions?
Could you just briefly say a few words about the Australian?
About AUKUS? In fact, I'm going to be doing a whole presentation on submarines and AUKUS on Wednesday. Is it
Wednesday evening, the ANS and INMM will have a joint dinner meeting at Puerto Rico in Sunreach. So it's going to be on that topic, but maybe you can just say a few words for those who can't attend.
Yeah, so the US, UK and Australia have agreed to a very broad security arrangement, part of which is about the supply of nuclear fueled submarines. They are not nuclear armed submarines, but nuclear fueled submarines, naval nuclear propulsion. And when it was first announced, the Chinese government went crazy for obvious reasons. I mean, it's a security issue for China. But some of the arguments they were using, it's illegal under the NPT, it's illegal under the statute. Neither of those is true. The idea is that Australia has to, any country, non-nuclear weapon state, that wants to use nuclear material for a non-prohibited military purpose, has to conclude an arrangement with the IAEA. So the Australians have requested the negotiation of these arrangements with the IAEA. They're in the process of negotiating right now. Brazil, not wanting to be outdone or maybe caught by the Australian example, they have also come to the agency and requested the negotiation of arrangements for the application of special procedures for the time during which nuclear material is used in the submarines. Why do they need a special arrangement? So that this isn't used as a way of diverting nuclear material through a submarine program. Okay. So the subject has been discussed ad nauseum in the Board of Governors. I think people have pretty much accepted that the arrangements will be negotiated and eventually brought to the IAEA's Board of Governors, which may or may not choose to insist on its right to approve it. The DG will probably present the arrangement to the board and say, okay. And the board may say, we want the right to be able to approve or not approve it. Or they might just say, we're happy to take note. That just remains to be seen. So there's a mechanism within comprehensive safeguards agreements called paragraph 14 that says if a state wants to do this, before they do it, they have to engage with the IAEA and conclude an arrangement with it. Okay. And as I said, both Brazil and Australia have initiated that procedure. It'll take a long time. My guess is it'll take at least another couple of years before they have those arrangements in place. Maybe faster, but
The question is, the field submarine is highly enriched uranium.
so interestingly enough, the Australians originally, I guess the idea was they were going to do LEU and they decided, no, they were going to do conventional. And then the Americans came and pulled the rug out from under the French and said, we'll do it, but we're going to offer HEU powered submarines. So as far as anybody knows, it's HEU. The Brazilians, LEU. Their boats are designed by the French, but the fueling technology is indigenous Brazilian technology, but LEU, which my view is a good idea.
So we had a couple of questions that were entered online. One is, in retrospect, do you think the US policy of nuclear electricity generation without reprocessing was justified?
There are two key choke points to the nuclear fuel cycle: reprocessing and enrichment. I recognize that there are issues associated with not reprocessing, but I think on balance, I think that was a smart decision. Now, unfortunately, hasn't always been possible to convince other states that this is the right policy to uphold. But I think on balance, it's until we can figure out how to do something differently, yes, I think that's the way to go. The similar question about enrichment. The UAE adopted the gold standard: no reprocessing, no enrichment. But then you have Saudi Arabia that's been pushing the US for nuclear cooperation. They're not so much interested in the gold standard, but if they use a different standard with Saudi Arabia, UAE has a most favored nation clause, so that will have to be renegotiated almost certainly. So I think that was certainly well-intentioned and would be a good idea if we followed globally.
Any questions? I have one more from online, but I want to give the people precedence. Okay. What would you say, and I think you covered this in your presentation, but maybe just as a recap, what would you say has been the biggest non-proliferation challenge since the atomic espionage in the late 1940s?
UAQCON's theft of enrichment technology from Urenco. He went on a sales binge, helped the North Koreans, the Iraqis, the Iranians, the Libyans. That whole black market was huge. I mean, in terms of state activities, obviously Iran, Iraq, North Korea, huge. But the black market was a really significant event, and almost nobody was successfully prosecuted in that. But he spread the knowledge wide and well. Yeah, so that was another major issue in the context of safeguards and whether the agency had any role to play in verifying the non-transfer of nuclear technology.
Okay. Last chance for questions.
28 years in an hour. Like my Godzilla?
Godzilla was good. So as I mentioned, there is going to be a dinner in Puerto Rico on Wednesday night. If anyone's interested in that, supposed to RSVP by today to martino@bnl.gov. So if you need that email address, send me an email and I'll send it to you. I'm sure they can take a few more reservations by tomorrow.
I'm sure it's standing room only.
Yeah, we already have 40 people signed up, so it will be a very nice evening. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I know the weather is kind of crummy outside, so it's very nice to see you all, and we'll be on the way out.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Thanks.